Hold on. Yeah, I want to make sure we record the whole thing. Okay. So we are recording. I would like to thank you all for coming today. This is the very first one of these that we've done in I don't know how many years. Way too many. So we have Professor Brant Lee from the School of Law today to really give us some insights into race and equality in the law. I have known Brant for, oh goodness, how old is Taryn now?
Taryn is now 21, about to be 21.
So I think I've known him for 17 years. Our kids used to play music together. Violin, Suzuki. Probably when Taryn was like 3 or 4.
Yes.
And they all used to run around together, and that's where I met him. I didn't even know he was a professor of law at the time. And then, lo and behold, I find out he's Brant Lee. So, so like I said, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Williams Honors College and our students. And take it away, Brant.
Sure. So thanks for that introduction. I am a professor of law and assistant dean for diversity and social justice initiatives. It's a very fancy title that I made up myself, so that was fun. We're going to talk about racial equality and the law, a topic which has been sort of at the forefront in the last year and a half. Right? So you all know, right, in the summer of 2020, America's confronting racial inequality. The initial focus was on policing practices, the criminal justice system, but pretty soon the scope of national attention broadened, right, to all kinds of, to the state of racial inequality in general. And I mean, it started with George Floyd, and pretty soon the debate shifted to implicit bias, structural racism. Books about racism were at the top of the bestseller list. Institutions of every kind issued statements, right, declaring how important racial equality was to them. Neiman Marcus, right, issued a statement about their solidarity, right, with those seeking more racial equality. I say that because there has not in my lifetime been quite this much attention paid from the general public to critical perspectives on race, right, than ever before, right? Not as much as there was at the end of last summer. So that's the context in which my dean came to me and asked if we could offer a free online course to the general public on race and the law, kind of as the law school's response to the moment. And I agreed to do that. And we expected a healthy response from the community. We expected to get a little bit of PR, maybe a class of 50 or 100 people. But the response was overwhelming. We had over 5,000 people enrolled in this online class. Actually, we had to pause registration several times to check with IT if we would be able to deliver right on a course to that many people. So that sort of begs the question, what is this all about? Why are so many people so interested? In the past few years, the Obama presidency, the reaction to it, actually I would even broaden that to the scope of American history up to now, right, has demonstrated, I think, that there isn't an issue that's more crucial to deal with than race. I'm going to focus on how race is sometimes seen in the national narrative as kind of a peripheral issue. It's sort of a nagging vestige. It's kind of a side plot in the general story of American progress. Or that maybe class or capitalism is a more important lens to view things through. But I think that what the last couple of years has shown us is that there is no amount of material or technological or business innovation progress, right, that will prevent our society from falling apart. We don't get a handle on issues like race that divide us. So It turns out that being able to coexist in relation to each other um, is an essential piece of our ability to move forward. And somehow race has prevented uh, uh, people from joining together and demanding that government function better, right, for everyone. Um, some people have been convinced or have convinced themselves, right, that the Confederate flag is more important than a living wage, or more concerned about maybe socialism or welfare than about receiving health care, right? More concerned about the perceived perils of critical race theory than about the lethal contagious disease. So that's why race matters. So I'm going to present two main ideas today. The first idea is how we can only understand the world using narratives that are available to us. And when it comes to race, we mostly have two old, tired narratives. And the question is whether we can get beyond merit and malice. I'll explain more about that in a minute. The second idea is about alternative perspectives, alternative ways of understanding our history as a country. It won't shock you to know that people of different races perceive that history a little bit differently. I'm going to say something about how to think about that. But before we do that, I want to make some preliminary observations. I taught this class. I knew the slides will show up. It's very bizarre. There we go. I knew there would be strong feelings, as there still are today. Right? I had this incredibly wide spectrum of students in this class. I did a survey. I had at least one professor of African American history. Judges were taking this class. So some people with a lot of knowledge about my topic. And also my mom, 87 years old in San Francisco, taking this class. A friend of mine, who the only reason I know him is that he was a fellow high school band parent, right, who mows lawns. So really wide, and I had to sort of figure out, well, how am I going to talk to all of these people with sort of the same language? Because everyone's starting from such a different perspective. And one of the things I said right from at the outset is that there were already going to be two different audiences, right, who were taking the class together. And there isn't any way for me to say something that means the same thing to everybody in that audience. And of course, specifically, I'm talking about, right, that I did the survey that about 2/3 of the class was white, about 1/3 black. And it's not surprising, maybe a little bit natural to understand that, some people paid more attention to certain episodes in history than others. Kind of makes sense if you're black to have paid a little bit more attention to policies that affect you, right, than others might. And that means not because, anybody is smarter or paying better attention to important things, right? But just kind of as a natural consequence, people bring so much different information to the discussion. Right? And so, that doesn't mean that that black people are smarter or more observant than white people, right? It does mean that because they have paid more attention, they might have more information. So as I was teaching, I was very aware that some things that I said were going to be news to people, and some things were not, right? And in particular, it might be news to more white people and not news to more black people. And I tried to actually address that in the talk, right, in the class, so that people would be aware that I was aware of that. Because one of the things that happens is you start to talk about you. I'm trying to reach the majority of the class. So I'm saying, here's something that you might not understand, although they might understand it. And already I'm saying you, the white people, and they, the black people, right, which is sort of replicating the putting white people at the center of the talk. So let me get to the meat of this. Right? Actually, let me say one more thing before we get to the meat of this. Another observation that I made to this sort of divergent audience of people that are going to take a class about race was to point out that I am obviously not black and not white. You may have noticed already. And the class was almost entirely about black and white. And this talk is going to be almost entirely about black and white. And the reason for that is not because there's not a lot of interesting and different things to say about other races. Right? I could talk your ear off about Asian American history if you like. My great-great-grandfather came here in 1885, and he had a photo ID that he had to carry because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, that you couldn't come to the United States for Chinese races. There's lots of history that's really interesting to me, right? But the clashing narrative about black and white, right? That's the conflict that brings us here today, right? That's the conflict that's a part of the American consciousness. And I wanted to sort of explain that, right? In the 1920s and 30s, when Asian people were being excluded and Latinos were being deported and Native Americans were being, actually tribes were being what they call terminated, which is not necessarily wiped out, but de-identified, right? And African Americans were being lynched, right? All of those things were happening at the same time, and sometimes we see those things as separate, and we don't realize that they're all connected, right? So let me go back to these two narratives. My claim is that when we fail to connect on racial issues, it's a failure of imagination. It's a failure of imagination to think beyond merit and malice, and here's what I mean. So the key unavoidable fact that underlies race relations in America today is the persistence of racial inequality. So if I told you that this chart shows infant survival rates, Ohio actually is 49 out of 50 states in black infant mortality. Or I could say, actually this chart shows household wealth. Or it shows the number of job offers received with identical resumes depending on what the name is on the top of it. Or it shows home ownership or college degrees or life expectancy. You'll notice there's no numbers up there. And my point is just that I don't think anybody's surprised. We take it as we have default knowledge that there is racial inequality and that is persistent. The reason that's so important is that as human beings, we try to find meaning, right, in the facts that we see in the world. So it's an ordinary response to think, well, why would that be? And that's where I'm saying these two narratives come in. And it might already be making you feel uncomfortable because these narratives function in a way that makes us uncomfortable. So the problem is that there's these two narratives. They're really old and really tired, but they're the only ones, they're the ones that we rush to. The first narrative is that the cause of inequality is malice or racism. And the paradigmatic symbol of that racism is Bull Connor. He's attacking peaceful demonstrators with fire hoses and dogs. And the problem with this narrative is that most white people, right, don't see themselves as Bull Connor. Right? They think that this kind of racism is long since past. And though obviously not entirely, I would say that for the most part, right, they're right. This kind of racism is not the kind of racism you see today. Now there's a softer version of this, right? The softer version is, well, yeah, maybe it's not intentional, conscious, malicious racism. Maybe it's unconscious racism or institutional racism or structural racism or one of these other versions, right? But the underlying structure of that narrative remains the same, right? We are looking for a bad guy. Where's the racist? Right? That's sort of one way to respond to seeing reports of inequality. So the other narrative we use to explain persistent inequality is merit. This is a narrative that says fair competition on an unbiased playing field results in racial inequality. The paradigmatic example of that is a race where everyone starts with the same starting line. And the problem with this explanation is that there are plenty of smart, talented black people working really hard and not seeing the rewards. So they don't see themselves as lacking merit, and they're right too. And again, there's a softer side of this part of the explanation. You could say that the merit deficiency is due to poverty, or maybe it's due to unequal educational opportunities, or maybe it's due to culture. But I want to point out, right, the underlying structure of this narrative also remains the same, which is that we're looking for the source of the problem in the party with the inferior merit. Right, we're saying we're looking for a deficiency. Right? So I'm not even talking about which of these narratives is more accurate. What I want to point out is that both of these narratives serve as simultaneously an accusation and a self-serving rationalization. You guys may have heard about self-serving rationalizations. Let me talk about the accusations first, right? You see a story about racial inequality, a study of some kind, talking about percentages and so forth. And I'm going to claim that just by seeing that, these narratives are so ubiquitous. Just by seeing that, at least some white people are going to already feel like they're being accused of being racist. And some black people are going to already feel accused of being inferior. Just placing that topic on the table. And I want to talk about the self-serving rationalization part, because this is, you may have seen, this is called attribution error. You may have taken a psychology class or something and learned about this, right? Really, really common that for us to do this, right? Human beings, we take credit when something good happens, right? We say, oh, that's because of our skill or our talent or our hard work. And when something bad happens, we say that was really bad luck, or maybe it was because somebody else did it, right? That's somebody else's fault. And so, you know, the example that I often give is that I exercise hardly at all, and I eat pretty much anything I want. And I cannot tell you how morally superior I feel, right, when I'm standing next to somebody who really struggles with their weight. And I've just told you that I know consciously that that is through no benefit or merit of my own. But I'm not saying this is justified, right? I'm just talking about how I feel. I feel like, oh, I'm kind of like, I'm better in some ways, right, than this other person. And so I think it's really common. It's really almost second nature. It happens all the time. But because of that, it's no mystery, right, why white people would be attracted to meritocracy as an explanation for racial inequality, and why black people would be attracted to racism or malice as an explanation for inequality, right? And again, I haven't said anything about which of those is more accurate, just talking about how we would ordinarily just sort of go to these corners, possibly. Right? And then the last thing I want to say about that is, you know, I've kind of presented these as though they're kind of emotionally equivalent, right? We each have subjective reasons why we might prefer one explanation to another. And so everyone's feelings are valid, right? But how do we make decisions between competing stories in a democracy? The answer is that we vote. And so we vote for legislators who are either going to impose or adopt or terminate affirmative action programs. Right? We decide whether we're going to adopt policies that address things that interfere with the work functioning meritocracy, right? Maybe we don't like regulation because that interferes with the natural marketplace in some way. And that's based on, you know, being committed to a certain version of how meritocracy is supposed to work. So, you know, the bottom line on what that says, if we are nothing more than the helpless victims of our self-rationalizations, we're just doomed to, like, black people are just doomed to think that everyone's racist, and white people are doomed to think that it's all about merit. I'm hoping that's not the case, but if it were, then merit wins in a democracy because there are more white people than black people. I don't have to tell you, I don't think. That's not exactly a firm moral basis, right, on which to ground an approach, right, or a theory or a policy. Okay. So now we're going to talk about different narratives of America. So I kind of want to take this, we have this narrative about what happens in particular instances when there's inequality as a result. And I want to broaden that to talk about how we understand our country. So I'm going to do this really quick. There's this mainstream narrative, and by the mainstream narrative, I mean, the way you learn about it in school, right? The story that's kind of the default story in the back of your head that your imagination turns to when you're trying to fill in the gap and to understand how the importance of a flag or a monument, right? And so, what did you learn about the founding fathers, right? That's what we learned about America. They brilliantly created this new thing, right? A form of self-governance, never before seen. No more kings, self-governance. And we all understand that they have their blind spots. They were creatures of their time, right? They left out women, they left out black people, indigenous people, even white people without property, right? But the principles they established, right? The mainstream story doesn't deny that all those things happened. But the principles they established are lasting and eternal principles, especially after we passed the Bill of Rights and a little while later. And then in the 19th century, right, America carried out its manifest destiny to extend its reach across the continent. Is this ringing a bell from like 7th grade or 11th grade or something? Capturing new territory by purchase or conquest till we stretched from sea to shining sea. And we weren't perfect, right? We acknowledged we treated Native Americans poorly and that conquest is not exactly a moral principle. And then we had the Civil War and we abolished slavery, right? That is a huge step towards making legal equality real. And after the Civil War, what do you know about Reconstruction? Or what do you remember about Reconstruction, this period after the Civil War? If you remember anything, what I remember from school is that the Northerners were corrupt drunkards and scalawags. And that black people who had just been slaves didn't know how to govern. And so the elect regime fell apart and they withdrew. There might have been a paragraph about sharecropping as an economic arrangement. But we passed by pretty quickly. And then we get to the 20th century, we have industrialization, the arrival of waves and waves of immigrants, yearning to breathe free, the great migration of black people to northward for industrial cities, for jobs, the Depression, the New Deal, the World Wars, all of this technological and military prowess. The 20th century is when America becomes a great nation, right, as we think about great nations, a beacon to freedom-seeking people everywhere. Towards the end of that, we got Brown versus Board and the Civil Rights Movement, right? We outlawed segregation, we outlawed discrimination. Together with Martin, we all dreamed of our children playing together, being judged by the content of their character. So a few warts, right? A few missteps, but constantly trying to become better, a general story of progress. Now that's a very rough, I just rushed through the entire history of America in one slide. Very sketchy, but I think it kind of captures the main plot, right? The main idea that we get. So now I'm going to go back and sketch out a different narrative. And when I presented this in the class, I asked people not to sort of judge these narratives with regard to whether they're good narratives or patriotic narratives, but to judge them on whether you can understand how people might see things this way. So, the original Constitution has a 3/5 clause. Now, some people misunderstand this, right? They think that this means that the Constitution only counted people as 3/5 of a person, right? And that is true, but it's not only. Because who was it that was advocating for black people to be counted 100%? Right? And the answer, it was the southern slaveholding states. Now, why would that be? Because the 3/5 clause shows up in a part of the Constitution, right, that talks about how congressional representatives are going to be apportioned. They're going to be apportioned by the number of people in each state, right? So this is still true today, right? California gets, 53 representatives. Ohio has 16 or so. And so that means you want there to be more people in your state, you get more representation. And everybody knew that the black slaves were not going to vote. So that means that the white voters, let's say in Virginia, if they could count all the slaves, they could say that we represent like this many more people. They wanted to count slaves 100%. The northern states said, no, you should not be able to count them at all. You're going to treat them like property. You're not going to let them vote. Why should you be able to get credit for that many people and be representing them? They're not really being represented, are they? Right? Since they're not being voted. Now, by the way, right? At the time, only white men, in fact, only white men with property in some places, right, that could vote. So it's not as though this non-representation wasn't also happening in other ways. So for instance, but children still can't vote. We still count children, right, and we represent them. Women couldn't vote. We still counted women, right? But in both of those circumstances, there's no reason to think that the number of women and children are unevenly distributed across states so that one would have more than a man, right? Black people were unevenly distributed, right? And so in Virginia in particular, right, black people were 40% of the population. Right? That means that their voting power, like the 3/5, you don't come up with a number like 3/5 unless it's a compromise, right? It's a compromise deal. That was the deal, right? They came up, they said, okay, you get to count 3/5 of a person, not the whole person, not zero, right? And as a result, Virginia's voting power in Congress was let's see, I actually have a number here, 33% higher, 40% higher than it would have been. That means that all the way through to the Civil War, right, the voting power of the southern states was magnified in Congress and in the Electoral College. This actually gets worse after the Civil War, and I'll explain why. But you sort of already see that the rules of democracy itself are tilted a little bit, right, on the basis of that original compromise. So that's the 3/5 clause. You know, you might already understand why, if you're black, the Constitution is not exactly, didn't do anything for you, right? Because you were still slaves for another 80 years. Right? So, you know, let me just talk about slavery for a moment. If you're black, chattel slavery is not a minor point in the United States. And so the fact that many of the founders enslaved black people, it's not like having bad habits. And now it's true that they were creatures of their time, right? But for black people, that was a pretty evil time, so maybe not that impressed with the Constitution that included slavery. And somehow, you know, it's kind of funny, we don't really study slavery itself. Slavery was the main economic engine of America for 2/3 of the whole 19th century. Really, it was growing, it was thick. If you counted the value of all the slaves held, right, it would be equal to it was 20% of the entire economy. It was equal to the value of all real estate in the United States, that proportion of the wealth. So, and it was expanding, right, all the way up until the Civil War. Sometimes we read that, oh, it's going to die all by itself. Slavery was very efficient, mostly through, you know, we squeezed labor out basically by torture. So that's what's going on all the way up to the Civil War. Civil War comes, you get Reconstruction. Let me give you a little bit of a different angle on Reconstruction. Right? Because black people in the South immediately after the Civil War flourished. They started businesses, they acquired property and capital, they voted, they ran for offices, they were elected. They formed political coalitions with poor white people. Right? They elected senators from the South during Reconstruction. You may have read recently that Senator Warnock was the first black senator elected from the South. They always say in modern times, but because there were black senators elected from the South during Reconstruction after the Civil War. Right? And the story of how a political deal was made, and in exchange for the White House, the federal government withdrew troops from the South and left black people at the mercy of cruel and unfair laws and violent, lawless mobs. That is a story. You know, black people who had a glimpse of what equality could look like, a picture of what liberty could be like, it effectively cast back into change. That's the story that should make you read. They had vagrancy laws that allowed white sheriffs to arrest black people on a whim if they didn't have a written employment contract, right? And then they would charge fees, and the fines would extend the sentence to a year, and then they would lease the convict out for labor, sometimes reportedly back to the same plantations where they had been slaves. Right? still could be arrested and for leaving their place of employment. Um, so, you know, the first half of the 20th century, the century when America emerges into greatness, there were over 4,000 lynchings, right, throughout the South, and also in other areas. Most of them with the complicity or express participation of law enforcement. And I just want to give you a picture, right? Some of these lynchings was the whole community gathered and brought picnic baskets and had their pictures taken with the corpses and then postcards sold, right, of the pictures. That great migration that I thought, that I learned in grade school, that was about jobs, that was people fleeing terror. So, you know, during that whole time, Black people were still persevering, still building themselves up, moving towards opportunity. Everywhere that they succeeded a little bit too much, there was a Wilmington or a Tulsa race riot, right? Thriving Black businesses, families, homes, built up painstakingly over the course of years, burned to the ground, or a family member disappearing and locked up for good, leased out for labor. And then the whole country is suffering, and the New Deal came around. But when it came around, Southern Democrats, and this, I said I was going to get back to this, Southern Democrats had by then, through intimidation and repression, complete control over all the legislative power in the South. They pretty much beat off and scared any contrary votes. So that means there was a solid South during the period that the New Deal was written. And I mentioned the relationship to 3/5. Right? So now they're counting 100, we're past the Civil War, right? We got rid of the 2/3 clause, or the 3/5 clause, right? We had the 15th Amendment, everybody gets to vote, right? So we're going to count everyone. But through intimidation and terror, we scared Black people away from voting. So now we get to count 100%. They finally got what they wanted, right? We got to count all the Black people, even though none of the Black people were voting. Right? And again, you get this tilt in sort of who had power in crafting legislation. So when you think about the New Deal and you think about programs that you might have heard about your grandparents or you know, parents or grandparents benefiting from the GI Bill, Social Security, labor laws, sort of all sorts of supports that came about at that time. That came about when the South had complete control, so they had a really big voice. So they had a racial hierarchy going on in the South, and they wanted to make sure, you know, some of them were pretty progressive economically, right? They wanted government help for poor people, but they wanted to make sure that it didn't upset the racial hierarchy. So they did that through two things. Either they said, for instance, with regard to Social Security or the wage and hour laws, right, minimum wage and all that stuff, either they said this doesn't apply to farm workers or domestic help. 60% of Black people were occupied in those categories. Or they said, we're going to administer those programs locally. Because they knew that if the state of Arkansas and the state of Mississippi was in charge of doling out the farm loans and the small business loans, right, that they could make sure that the right people got the loans, but the wrong people did not. So, sometimes people say it's been a long time since slavery, and it has, and we should look at what was happening every year, right, during that time. You know, there was a massive class action against the Department of Agriculture for systematically, discriminatorily rejecting farm loans that could have helped keep farms afloat, right? Farm loans that could have been how you could invest and do better. Just summarily dismissing the loans of Black applicants. You've heard these stories about the person behind the desk just crumpling up the loan right in front of them and throwing them in the garbage. Right? That class action settled for over $1 billion during the Obama administration. This is not ancient history. So all of that is just to say that you have these two stories, and But that is not a story of progress with, oh, we were fixing little things along the way. There's, people like to talk about Martin Luther King. Um, he did say he had a dream where we're not judged by the color of our skin. He also said this: our government was giving away millions of acres of land. Not only that, they built land grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided country agents to further their expertise in farming. And not only that, they provided low interest rates in order for them to mechanize their farms. And not only that, today, these people are receiving millions of dollars not to farm. And those are the people telling the black man that he needs to lift himself up by his own bootstraps. And Martin Luther King says, this is the reality. And now when we come to Washington in this campaign, we're coming to get our check. Now, like the first narrative, I just rushed through a lot of history in just a few paragraphs. This narrative is also gross oversimplification, right? I'm not contesting that, but so my question is, which narrative tells more accurately the story of America? And is it the America of principled ideals and imperfect union, slowly becoming more perfect? Or is it the America of heart-wrenching, heroic perseverance against one unimaginable hurdle after another? Now, there are, of course, elements of both. Elements of truth in both stories, right? And so judging which story better captures America is inevitably subjective, right? Maybe you identify more with one story or another. What I want to point out is that identification, like when you think, okay, I think that's what the story is. I can see myself as part of that story. That identity is totally constructed. What do I mean by which story is it hard to point to and say that's our story? And if one of them is harder, if it's harder if you're white, to say that the story of the family fleeing lynching is our story. Why? Why is that hard for you to say that's our story? I mean, there are very few of us that are descended from property of white Englishmen. But we get the founding fathers presented a story that we can all embrace. That's us. And, I will note that we have been asking non-white people to identify across race lines and identify with like the founding fathers of America, all along. And we do have the imagination to do that, right? That is not an impossible thing to do. Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton, right, is evidence that we can identify across racial lines with the story of the founding fathers. I'm going to close, and then we can have some questions. I'm going to close with something Thurgood Marshall said. He gave a speech in 1987 on the bicentennial of the Constitution. We so idolize and revere the founding fathers in the Constitutional Convention. Marshall makes this observation, right? That the rights that matter came after the Civil War and the Equal Protection Clause. So let me read you this quote. Thus, in this bicentennial year, we may not all participate in the festivities with flag-waving fervor. Some may more quietly commemorate the suffering, struggle, and sacrifice that has triumphed over much of what was wrong with the original document, and observe the anniversary with hopes not realized and promises not fulfilled. And I want to just pause there. That's a pretty good approximation of this alternative narrative, right, that I've been talking about. It is triumphant, but kind of in a sober, adult way, right? And the question is that a national narrative that we can embrace? So he goes on. I plan to celebrate the bicentennial of the Constitution as a living document, including the Bill of Rights and the other amendments protecting individual freedoms and freedoms. If you ever hear there being a debate over how to interpret the Constitution, whether we should interpret it as it was written, right, as it was intended when it was written, or whether we should consider it a living document, right? Remembering that it's not until after the Civil War that we eliminated slavery and gave everyone the right to vote and put an equal protection clause into the Constitution. Even with that equal protection clause was interpreted to allow segregation and sharecropping and right, Jim Crow. So all of those are still permissible under the Constitution with the Equal Protection Clause. It's not until we get a Supreme Court that reinterprets the Equal Protection Clause, we get Brown versus Ford. When Marshall says, I'm not celebrating the bicentennial, 200 years ago is not what I care about. The beginnings of what I care about were after the Civil War when we had the 14th Amendment. But even then, right, we did not fulfill the promise until we maybe started to fulfill the promise in Brown versus Ford. And there's a debate to be had about what happened after that as well. Right? So when he says it's a living document, right, that's what that argument is about. So the last thing I'm going to say, how did the media cover the speech? Here's one of the headlines that came out the very next day. Marshall blasts celebration of constitutional rights. You know, well, maybe you don't know, the surveys often show that white people don't consider black people to be as patriotic as white people. And maybe it's time for our image of what counts as patriotic to grow up, to mature into a more thoughtful form. Maybe we can come to understand together, right, that quiet reflection on the constant struggle required to continue to push our country forward is being undertaken. We are pushing forward, recognizing that that constant struggle comes at a cost, that we really have no choice but to pay. That? Any questions?
So we have some time. Questions? Maybe in the audience, if you're at home, feel free to type questions into the chat, and I will relay them on to.
This is totally unrelated, but just a question I ask pretty much every speaker I ever talk to. What's three recommend for people that are people three books that
So
pertaining to this or not?
Yes, in keeping with the theme, I'm gonna talk about race books. For just three, I would recommend a book called Color of Law by Richard Rothstein that that traces how federal home loan policies, right, created vast amounts of wealth for white people at a time when the housing was segregated, which helps to explain the current wealth gap.
I'm sorry, Brant, what was the title of that book?
It's called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein.
Color of Law.
Second book I would recommend is called The Sum of Us by Heather McGee. That just came out this year. Her thesis is about the things that all of society loses because we're fixated on race. Right? And one of the central examples, the illustration that she uses, she talks about how public pools started to really come into vogue after World War II, 50s, and then Brown versus Ford came about, and the order came that you had to integrate the public pool. And communities all across the country closed their pools rather than integrating. In some places they filled them with concrete. Right? Nobody, we have to share this. Nobody's going to have this, and everybody loses. I have to say, I have not done the research about exactly what happened in Akron, but I did have the experience when I moved here 25 years ago of checking to see in the summer where does everybody go swim, and in Akron, a lot of people swim country club, at the tennis club, at the Jewish Community Center, all these private institutions. Where are the public pools? There are two public pools. They're now being kind of refurbished for renewed use. But in my perception, at least, right, they have been decrepit for a very long time. And I don't know if that traces back to that time, but it follows a pattern where it could. Let's see, I've been recommending two books.
What was that? What was the title of that one again?
The Sum of Us.
Sum of Us?
Yes. Let's see, come up with a third book. I'm just gonna I'm just gonna kind of punt on the topic and tell you one of my favorite books recently, which is by N.K. Jemisin, science fiction. It's called The Fifth Season. N.K. Jemisin is the first person ever to, she put 3 books out in a trilogy, science fiction trilogy, right? 3 successive years, won the Hugo Award all 3 times.
Yeah, thank you for talking.
Other questions about anything at all? In a little few weeks, I'm going to be talking about critical race theory. I don't know if you've heard about that controversy or not. Not exactly what this is, but please, closely related.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned these 2 viewpoints. Sort of, what would it take? What will it take to have, I guess, people recognize those 2 poles and hopefully land somewhere in the middle? And when I say what will it take, what do you think it will take from an individual perspective? And also, what will it take from a societal perspective / what can we do to further that journey along?
So, are you talking about the malice narratives that are more like individuals? Are you kind of talking about the American narrative about who we are?
The malice.
The malice one. So there's a couple of things that I tend to say about that, right? One of them is, it's my hope that by articulating those things out transparently, right, the next time you're confronted with a debate about whether some policy is fair along racial lines or not, and you start to respond in a particular way, either instinctively saying there's racism here, right, or instinctively saying this is just fair, right? There's no that you just entertain a little humility, right? Entertain a little bit of, okay, that's a self-serving explanation, and you examine that a little bit more. Second thing I've been trying to do, actually, there's a different talk that I did, is we get trapped in these narratives, and we're like, you get this inequality, and you think, well, there's no other answer. Either they're not as good, but maybe it's not their own fault, but right, either they're just not competing, or there's a racist in the world, right? Somewhere, systemic, unconscious, whatever. And there are lots and lots of examples in the ordinary business world where we all understand that you can do better without superior merit, right? So one example is branding, right? The Coca-Cola company still controls like some huge 40% of the world market for soft drinks, right? Is that because they in Atlanta invented the best beverage ever? It's not merit, right? It's because they have successfully made Coca-Cola the embodiment of fresh American, I don't know what it is, elan, right? Some kind of energy that you associate Coca-Cola with. Makes you want to teach the world to sing, right? And the other example I give is Microsoft Windows. Microsoft Windows still controls like 85% of the world's laptop, and desktop computer operating systems. Is that because Microsoft is the best operating system ever invented? Right? I'm going to suggest that at least part of the reason Microsoft works succeeds so well is because it succeeds so well, right? If you do buy Windows, you buy Windows because everybody else has Windows. Buy Windows because some people know how Windows works. The tech support will understand your computer. There'll be more applications written for Windows, which is also because everybody has Windows. If you're an employer and you're buying a computer system and you want to not have to retrain all your employees, you use Windows because they'll come in and they'll probably already know how to use it, right? And none of that is because Windows is better. It's just because. So this is just an exercise in imagination. In what ways might whiteness be like Windows? Right? If I'm hiring, especially an outward or public-facing employee, and I want more people not to be scared, and I want more people to feel compatible and I want more people to think I'm going to be able to communicate with this person, I have a very rational reason why I might want to hire a white person, right? That's not about malice, that's just about, right? It's just about how people live, operate, and communicate, right? Or maybe whiteness is like a brand, right? See, whiteness, do you think, right? I mean, the last point about patriotism is kind of like that. You see, actually, I'm going to switch. You see an Asian American person, do you think patriotic? You know, and I say that because the stereotype for Asians is that we're foreign. And I think that people don't immediately think American. And maybe after I start to talk, and it becomes clear like that I don't speak with an accent, maybe people might say, oh yeah, he's American, but right, not the symbol of America. So I do think that there's some ways in which whiteness operates like a brand that signals things. Without us, not without, you know, without us knowing about it or anything. So a little bit of humility, broaden your imagination about what causes things, right? It's not always merit or malice. And then the last thing I'm going to say is, for a white audience who's trying to understand, maybe do the thing that we all are trying to do, like put yourself in the shoes of somebody else. And it is hard to do. We did not talk today about implicit bias. The problem with implicit bias is you can learn about it, it doesn't end it. You walk out with, actually, your implicit bias score is a little bit better immediately after the training, but then 2 hours later it's gone. So what can you do? It's got to be a longer term project. It's got to be, like if I want to think, when I see a black person, if I want to have more positive images come to mind, right? I have to read about good black people more than once. Maybe all the time. And over time, right, that might do it.
Other questions, comments? Let me check the online. See if there's anything. Nope. Okay, so thanks again, Brant. And I will plug him again. So the first Friday of every month, starting in October, and the third Thursday, we are having lunchtime talks. So they'll be short. For those of you who are familiar with something called Pecha Kucha, right? They're very short talks. Yours won't have to be 6 minutes and 40 seconds, but the intent is to have 2 10-minute talks at lunchtime, and we'll cast them, stream them online. They could be in person as well, depending on your preference. But you can go at 12:15, right? You can sit down, eat your lunch, and learn 2 cool things. So the first Friday the first Friday in October, I believe that's the 3rd. Brant Lee will be talking about critical race theory, and Dr. Steve Weeks from the Department of Biology will give us 100 ways to save the planet. Right, in 10 minutes. I didn't count. That's the title. So, like I said, please come back. Please join in, and then look for additional announcements for talks and seminars and events in the coming months.
And if anybody has any questions about law school, I can hang out with them.
All right, great. Thanks so much. Thank you. Also, cookies. Take some more cookies.
Don't you told me twice. No, I'm just kidding.
There you go. They will not.